Here's an example, and I always like to show this one. So one of the most compelling charts to me, and you can see it in my background, I have a poster of it,
Yes.
is the occupations of Negroes and whites in Georgia, which was plate 27. I like to call this a fan chart. It's not quite a pie chart, but it has aspects of a pie chart. And to me, it's very striking in that you can compare two sets of data in this striking way. In this case, they used, African Americans at the top and white people at the bottom. And you can compare using the proportions of the fan, if you will, what kind of occupations people had. So, for example, you can see the red wedge is, agricultural and fisheries. Mm-hmm. So you can see, again, back in, the late 1800s and 1900s, we were still a largely agrarian society.
Yeah.
And you can see the proportion of whites and Black people were almost the same doing that kind of work. But the other one that also stands out to me is the yellow wedge, which is domestic and personal service, right? Back in 1899, 28% versus 5.5%. So you can see that difference. Mm-hmm. You can also see the difference in professions, right? 4% versus, it's vanishingly small. But then I took that same data and using the data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics to show what has changed and what has not changed using the exact same kind of format, right?
Interesting. Yeah.
So the red wedge in this case, in the modern context, is management, professional, and related. 31.8% for African Americans and 41.4% for whites. Again, there's kind of, that disparity, but you can see a couple of things. You can see how we've moved from an agrarian society to one where management, professional, and so forth.
Yeah.
But it's also interesting to look at that service wedge, right? 23.8% in 2018 versus 28% in 1899. How much of a difference? But also, whites have increased in that area as well, 5.5% versus 15.9%. But you can also see the increase in production, transportation, and material moving. That's 16.3% for African Americans versus 11.3%. So to me, this is, the format that they used was compelling, and it's just as compelling using the modern data.
Yeah, it is, even, despite what folks might have to say about pie charts and our circles.
Right.
It's not a pie chart, so there.
It's not a pie chart.
Compelling, and it's beautiful.
Correct. So much so that I actually wrote a tool to make fan charts. So if you have your data, you can make your own fan charts, and I've got the tools there. Which I want to also make this point. All of my tools in data are open source, meaning that you can go on GitHub, take a look at it. You can look at the code. You can look at the data behind it. You can grab it and you can use it for your own purposes. I think it's really important to be able to give back in that sense. And it also allows me to improve the tools so that people, who want to be able to say, oh, Anthony, here's a bug, or Anthony, here's another way to do that. I can do that both to my benefit and to everyone else's benefit. So I think it's really important. I have, taken advantage of open source tools. I'd love to be able to give back in that sense as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. And we have the links to that, right? that are, going to be presented on the page with this video,
Right.
and in the future, so everybody can check those out.
Sure.
And so you have you've now built tooling to be able to create these. Are you finding in your work that the influence of kind of deep diving into this style for the last year and year plus, has that influenced the kind of visualizations that you create? Like,
I think it had.
Yeah.
I think it has. So one of the things that, if you go back to looking at things like, so there's another example of modern data, expenditures. Let me go quickly to, I have a catalog of all of the stuff here. So if you go to, let's say, the spiral chart here that people always, recognize.
Yeah.
That's kind of a novel invention, if you will. So the lesson, to answer your question, the lesson is, don't be afraid to embrace novel methods to being able to getting your message out, right?
Yeah.
This could have easily just been a conventional bar chart, right? But it's much more eye-catching when you see the data rolled up like this, right?
Yeah.
120 years later, we're still talking about these spiral charts, right?
Right.
So in my sense, my takeaway is not necessarily using these all the time, but to be able to say, break away from the defaults, right? So one of my frustrations with things like, the Microsoft tools and so forth is their defaults are terrible, right? So if you just take some data and just push the button and say, make a chart, it's horrible, right? And I think, this is my lesson to whoever is building tools: make really good defaults, because in many cases, people don't have the time or the inclination, that's not their job, to be able to spend the time to make it look as it should look. So give people really good defaults is a lesson here. So
that's an important point, I think, because when I'm thinking about people who are maybe they're building any number of things, a civic tech, right, or something where you look at like the police scorecard, right? They're participating, and the point of interacting with the tool is to get some information that's tailored to you. You put in your parameters, where you live or whatever it is, and you're meant to take this data, information, and advocate for yourself or for your community. But like you're saying, if the default of that output, like, this person is using the tool, they don't have the ability or the knowledge or the interest in, making it compelling for what they're trying to do. So the default is poor. Like, that means that all your people, like, your average nonprofit that really only has the resources to use the default settings on their tool, is disadvantaged in the story that they're going to be able to tell and making their case.
Exactly.
So, yeah, that's a good.
Yeah, so that's sort of my motivation was I wanted tools that I could control, right? Because the way that I use, for example, PowerPoint is probably different from a lot of people, right? So, the typical way of using PowerPoint is, just grab a template and throw some data in there, make lists and stuff like that. But what I learned is I wanted to be a student of what a compelling presentation looked like. If you start with a blank sheet and then build up your content from there, that's a better way of doing it. And that's kind of, how I embraced, doing these kinds of presentations. Obviously, the presentations that you're seeing here are all done in Dexshell, of course. So yeah.
Yeah, and I wonder how you feel, looking at something like the iconic spiral, since they were doing these things by hand,
Right.
I think about like the work of the Dear Data, that book. Have you seen that? And or even like your bullet journal crowd these days with little handmade, hand-drawn, collections of data points that are, end up being quite beautiful a lot of times. But the fact that you're having to do it by hand kind of shapes, it shapes what you conceive of doing. And so with machines, like your average computer user, like you're saying, like, don't be afraid to break the mold, because, you have shown here that even, digitally, you're able to still, achieve some of these designs. And, the machine, it was only someone's failure of imagination in using the machine that kept that type of visualization from, being something that's a default in Excel.
That's right. And so, because my thing is scripting, if you will, it's coding. Your palette is endless, right? So you've got these basic building blocks of building up things. So I think one question that you had was, which ones were hard to do?
Yes.
Okay, let's get into that one. So because I was stubborn and I wanted to make DexShell do everything and not use other tools. But one of the things that is interesting is that DexShell is a domain-specific language, meaning that you can have other programs make that code itself. So you don't have to write the code by yourself. You can have another program, if you will, make another program, and then you use that. So DexShell doesn't have any kind of notion of geographical information systems, right? The things that you typically see, like these choropleth things that you see, like for the state of Georgia.
Right.
So I had to invent that, right? So the question was, how do I do that? So it was very useful. I was talking, I guess, on Twitter, because what I tend to do is, if I'm working in progress, so my process for doing these recreations, let me back up, was as I would do one, I would post it on Twitter. If you go back to 2019 and look at my timeline, you'll see what kind of order I used to build these. It was not starting at 1 and ending in 56.
Right.
It was pretty random, right? So the ones that I thought I could knock out quickly, I did those.
Yeah.
So I forget that I was in conversation with somebody on Twitter, and somebody said, well, I was working on these maps and figuring out how to do it. And somebody said, oh yeah, I did that one too. And they had the basic data, i.e. the shapes of all of the counties of Georgia. And I was able to build a script that would take that data and build the polygons and also mesh them together to build this chart, right? So basically I was building sort of a rudimentary GIS using DexShell. So the point is, my whole point of, doing, starting things with very primitives and then building up, also worked here. So that was kind of the hardest one to do.
Yeah, that's interesting, because, GIS or maps, that have a big role in a lot of data advocacy work.
Of course.
And so that's pretty amazing that you were able to bring that over here.
Correct. Yeah. So that was probably the most challenging one. And then again, I used metaprogramming to, I had other scripts that would take their shape files and then turn them into polygons that could be used for DexShell, for example. And then you have another table that would, given the population, color them appropriately. I mean, I used the same kind of approach, for this one, let's make this bigger, for these kinds of maps. In this case, these were SVG. So I was able to use those and then convert them, have data, generate them appropriately, and then use them and annotate them. because again, what deck shell gives you is, you could say that that's, a disadvantage or advantage. You start with a blank page. You start with a blank canvas,
right?
And you build your things up from there. But then you can build higher level things like these bar charts, right?
Right.
So these bar charts, I already had a tool used called dchart to build those. So those were very simple to do.
Okay.
So it's a mix. Some were simple, some were not as simple. But because the DuBois work tended to use, bold colors and geometric shapes and these kind of things, it lended itself, I think, very well to this kind of treatment.
Okay. Yeah, another thing I think that kind of bucks convention and what makes these adds to their visual power, because they were making it as something you had that up actually, like the size of the posters, it was meant to be looked at from
absolutely
a little bit of a distance, but it does
correct.
Still translate to a smaller screen, like here. Right. And I think if you started small and created it and then blew that up, like I feel like the same choices, wouldn't be made for your average person making something that is, screen sized.
Right.
But but there's no reason for that. Like it clearly works.
Yeah, and that was one of the things that fascinated me when I first learned about the work was the scale.
Yeah.
Right. So these were big poster size things. They were, 23 by 28 inches. So, and that's why, again, I have the poster behind me to sort of show that. They were meant to sort of grab your attention as you're walking through that, and you can walk up and interact with them. And that was really important. And I think you're right, two things. The scale dictated some of the design choices, right? Yeah. You can't have too much, and also the colors, right? And you got to be able to grab somebody's attention. But they used a limited palette, which is also interesting as well.
Yeah.
But they used it to good effect. So, for example, the plate 51 here on the right, very starkly shows that distinction between slave in the black and free in green, right? That kind of thing. Yep. So scale and design are very, very, very important for this work.